Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So on our journey, following Jesus, and I just want to remind all the listeners that what we're doing right now with the Amazed and Perplexed perspective is we're trying to follow loosely chronologically as if we're right behind Jesus, looking around the room, trying to give dignity to everyone. I have been taught the Bible at times that the Pharisees, the apostles, pretty much everybody was an idiot in one way or another. And so how do we honor the people? Because when I honor the people, I see myself in them. So there is this part of what we're doing that we're trying to really see behind. You know, what is the emotional makeup? What's some cultural implications? And today we're going to look at the 12 apostles, specifically the choosing, and we're looking at the how Luke recorded it. It's in Luke chapter 6, verse 12. I'm just curious, what comes to mind when we're trying to set the scene, as it were? Is there anything contextually that you'd want to offer as we think through this passage?
Yeah, so just to set up, I think you and I both have touched a lot on kind of making fun of the disciples and their ineptitude at certain points and their immaturity and just the very real, the rawness at which they're presented in the Gospels. And there's a part of that I think is valid and fair. I also think one of the cool things we can draw upon is thinking about, well, why did Jesus choose 12, and why did Jesus choose why did he have to choose 12? Why do you have to designate? And you know, if you spend some time around Bible, I'm sure like there's kind of the natural jumping connection to the 12 tribes of Israel, and you know, some symmetry that maybe Jesus is playing on there, and then thinking about how I think giving dignity to these people is then to begin to think about them as not representatives of the 12 tribes necessarily, but thinking about the story of the Israelite people and how they kept turning away from God and how they kept not getting it. And then remembering like, oh, that's not just the story of God's people. Like that's my story. That's repeatedly my story. And so like, as we process through all these questions of why Jesus does it this way, why the number, why these individuals, we can ask that question about ourselves anytime. Why Jason and Connor at this table right now? Why me to even begin with? And yeah, I think there's some healthy questioning along those lines.
I think that is a really good thing, and I wanted to tap into specifically the idea that every human being ever has a lot of expectations. You know, the joke is men aren't thinking anything. That may be true in terms of in the ratio of how much women thinks. Women thinks.
How much then women thinks?
Women thinks. I knew. Anyway, but that idea of every situation you walk into, you have expectations of. And I think it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of, I've just been around a lot of people like, I don't expect anything. Like that's a sign of maturity not to expect anything. It's not. Yeah. Because it's not true. And if it was true, you had no expectations, you'd have no disappointments. Because if you get out and your car's all four tires are flat, you're like, oh, I didn't expect them to be filled. No, you did. But if you get angry at life, if you complain about stuff, that's an indication that you had expectations that were not met. And it's not bad or good. It's like most things, it's what you do with it. And I think it's just important that these men aren't just cast. They're not just role players in this thing. They had real lives. They were born into families. They were treated well. They were mistreated. They were raised. Their families had, I don't know Jewish culture enough to know the kind of dreams they had. They're in at least several of them are in their father's line of work, which I assume is the norm. But they had expectations of what everything meant, just like every human ever. And I think that's important to keep in mind, not just for this choosing experience, but all the way through the Gospels.
Yeah, that's so good. And this in itself, and maybe this is stealing an extra amazement, you know.
You were
I'm double dipping here, but I think there's a sense in which we can think about it's so easy to think about what Jesus comes to do in these broad strokes of history, broad theological strokes of solving the problem of sin and death. And then like all those things are true in reality. But they're also like, if we get caught up and lose sight that there was a flesh and blood human God man named Jesus who had a beating heart and who walked and lived and performed miracles and loved, then like all of those high-minded concepts and broad historical strokes that we love to pontificate about are ultimately meaningless. In the same way, you think about the reconstitution of what Israel was supposed to be, and the fulfillment of God's promises to those people. Well, you can talk about the kingdom of Israel being the way it was always supposed to be, but like if it's just like an amorphous kingdom, or it's an ideal kingdom, or if it's an ideal, like it's some ideal like blurry vision of a person when you picture that, then like that's not real life.
Right.
But if you can point to somebody, and you can point to Peter, or you can point to John and be like, I know what John looks like, and God, or God man Jesus, says that he is a part of the kingdom of God, and that when he loves and he lives, and he's sharing and helping bring about the kingdom of God, like I know it drags the broad strokes of history down into the depths of dirt and soil. And that's what Jesus does, is he descends from the mountaintop. As we're about to read here, as he goes to the mountaintop to pray, Jesus descends from the mountaintop into the blood and soil of our lives. And I just think it's incredible and amazing to me. And it's just really important to remind ourselves that there is symbolism here, but it's also like, it's important to be able to point at somebody and be like, yeah, Jesus chose Jason, and Jesus chose, Bartholomew, and be able to point and be able to look at them and say that.
Right. And I'm about to jump into reading, but the thing that I want to remind us, and we kind of assume this, but especially if you're new to the Amazed and Perplexed journey, it's that concept of Jesus wants you to notice his humanity, and he wants you to notice their humanity, or else he wouldn't tell us about their humanity. He could easily have skipped over those parts. He could easily have said, here's the social media presentation of them, but he chooses to show these weaknesses and misunderstandings and ineptitude, like you said earlier, on purpose, so that we can recognize, oh, that's me in this story. And so that's really, really important to how he wrote especially the Gospels.
Yeah. So I'll read and direct you, since I already kind of, jumped ahead and started my amazement. We'll reverse how we usually do it a little bit. So starting in verse 13 of Luke chapter 6. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles: Simon, who he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So, Jason, what amazes you?
The thing that really catches my attention with this is how it's just a normal Tuesday or Thursday or Saturday.
One of those days.
It's just a normal day to them. I don't even know how much time they spent with him up to this point, how much time they spent with Jesus. And there was a larger group of disciples at one point later, after Jesus resurrected, it says he visited with like 500. So we don't know where the ministry is at right now. We don't know how many people are with him all the time. We talked, I don't know, a couple months ago now about the women that were with him. And so there's a collection of people that are already with him, more than 12. And so it's just fascinating to recognize that they don't know their life is about to be totally changed. They know he's something special. They know that they were, if you know anything about the rabbinical culture and how they would choose their disciples very young, they're most likely, these men are at an age where they're beyond being chosen by a rabbi, and they've accepted their role in the society is to be fishermen or tax collectors or whatever they were. I don't think zealot is an official job title, but you see what I'm saying is they were these were not old men, by the way. They were most likely what we would consider young, 18, 19. But I would say they probably entered adulthood at 13. You know what I mean? So they've been adults for a while in their cultural understanding. But they have no idea that when Jesus comes back, I don't know if he's like, hey, everybody, let's meet at sunup or, at 9:30 or whatever. But he takes this completely normal moment and it's dynamically life-changing. Where would we be? Even for those that don't believe in Jesus, we know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Most people have some awareness of Peter the apostle or Paul the apostle, who will be another apostle that's brought in. But this idea of him choosing how he makes this completely commonplace, normal moment so incredibly powerful, he changes the whole of history. And so where that leaves my brain is, what is he doing today that is changing history that I don't pay attention to and I won't know for 10 years that, that conversation was what shifted? And that to me taps into the mystery and the wonder and the awe that God's creativity and cleverness and brilliance could bring to our life all the time, that we're like, I wonder what he'll do with this. I wonder what he'll do with this conversation right now, the very common words coming out of my mouth, and how it just amazes me.
You would think even if you're somebody like within the sound of my voice who doesn't believe that Jesus is who he says he is, it's undoubtedly true that these 12 men are some of the most impactful people in the history of humanity. Jesus certainly is, and then these 12 men and how their mission and their lives changed the course of history is undoubtable. You would think there's a grand, if you study history, you'll have these moments where Julius Caesar is getting ready to cross the Rubicon, and he has these epic words to give of as he declares basically his intention to march on Rome. You think about Alexander the Great, and you think about the famous quotes he has as he realizes his full his full dream of conquering the world. Everyone knows that the famous quote of, he wept because there was no more nations to conquer. You would think that this grand moment, these men, as long as humans have language, these men will be known. You would think that there would be some grand, there'd be some grand thing that was some grand, I'm trying to think of the right word. What's the word I'm searching for? Not like a graduation, but there'd be some ceremony, some grand ceremony of, I dub thee, whatever. And it's not that. And that just leads credence to what you're talking about here, of giving dignity. If God is in every moment and God is with me always, recognizing that when I assume that he can't do grand, incredible things in this small moment that I would consider nothing, when you say it out loud, you go, well, that's silly. But it's we always assume that we will know in the moment when something is grand and epic, and that's not true. And that's not what God calls for us. Luckily, that's not God's not hey, have the foreknowledge and be in the moment. But also, I echo in your rejoicing of knowing of okay, all of the ingredients for the epicness of this moment for Jesus and the disciples, those ingredients are there in my daily life.
That's exactly right. And I think that really explores it a little bit more for me. I think in general, there's something about the way we tick as humans, and we're all different, but I do think there are lots of common threads. We may live it out differently, but we have some of these same dynamics where we're like, if I don't have some mystery that I'm working to solve, and again, it's going to look different, you solving the mystery versus me solving the mystery, and what mysteries interest me. But that kind of idea that what will happen next and that excitement that's up around the corner, I think it's tied to hope. I think it's tied to faith. I think it's needed. And I think when we feel our lives, in particular, our lives with God are stale, I think it's an important question is, how much do I experience wonder? How much do I experience awe in my life? And if I'm not experiencing it, why? Does that mean God is not a God of imagination and creativity and suspense and surprise? Or does it mean I've shut that part out because your free will can shut out the work of God? That's the main unique features of humanity is we can say, no, I don't want any of it, God. And when we exert ourselves to block out God, and in particular, I'm talking about Christians, I'm not talking about atheists. Ironically, atheists may have a greater sense of wonder and awe, because they know they don't know necessarily what's going to happen, where a lot of times we're taught Christianity means what's going to happen. Well, God's not going to work that way. And I'm like, you couldn't live in the Bible and say God's not going to work that way and participate in what God actually does, because you would never know. There's none of the stuff that happens in the Bible. You're like, well, of course he's going to part a sea here. It's like, no, you wouldn't be thinking that.
Yeah. Well, and Moses walked on what became holy ground for decades of his life, not knowing that one day Yahweh would appear to him in the form of a burning bush. And yet, there has to be a realization of that God was not more in that, in that space, in that moment, than he was 2 weeks before that moment happened.
Absolutely right.
So yeah, getting onto so this helps kind of transition to my second, my double dipping of amazement, if you will.
Life is so unfair.
I know, it is what it is. I think it would be so easy with that mindset of that realization of God is here in this moment just as much as he is in the moment that I got saved, and he was, I could it's easy to get caught up in that and to assume okay, well, that invalidates some of those other mountaintop experiences or that lessons or that or that those are moments that we should not even seek to have, because if we're really following God, then we'll know that those are just all the time, all around us, no matter what. And what I love here is that Jesus, who has more access, this seems like a bold theological claim. I think it's true. More access to the Father than we do, or a clear access. I don't know however you'd phrase that. Seems to has a deeper relationship with the Father than you and I do. Still needs to find space. Still needs to make space and be intentional about that connection. And I think this is one of those things where it helps me see the humanity of Jesus. If I assume pre-creation, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Jesus is not having to go onto the non-created mountaintop to commune with the Father. I assume that it's instantaneous. It's outside of time. It's the beautiful dance that we can't even begin to comprehend of what the Trinity is. But for me, what is amazing about this is it's the taking on of humanity. It's recognizing about what this must be like for Jesus, and just thinking about how thinking about what it must be like for him to think about I've got this decision coming up about who I'm going to make my disciples, and thinking about is he anxious about getting time to go on a mountaintop to pray to God? Is he excited for it? Is he yearning? Is he I would love to know what headspace he was at. But I think the conversation we had right before this part, I think it's helpful to remember. It's just helpful for me that God is everywhere, God is in everything, God is through everything. But then also even Jesus, it's helpful for Jesus to make space and time to talk with his God, to talk with his Father.
Yeah, I think so. I have a story that I go back to. I feel like enough that people would know it if you've been listening. But I was part of a missions group, and we would do all-night prayer sessions. And I think that's fine. I think it's fine. But they would always cite this passage, and I'm like, Jesus didn't have an all-night prayer session. Jesus went out to pray, and he prayed so much, he prayed all night.
Yeah.
And there's a big difference, because when you do an all-night prayer session, to get through the night, there'd be maybe 20, 30 of us that would do it. You have structure to keep you engaged, and we're going to pray together, and then in small groups, and then individually, and then we'll come back. You know what I mean? It wasn't like that. It was very much for Jesus, just this pouring out. And I think that is just a really important signal. Is this was not a spiritual discipline in the sense, man, I better get my prayer time in because I got to turn in my schedule to whoever, you know. This was him wanting to commune and longing to commune. And he had some sense he needed to choose people, which kind of leads into my perplexion. But it is that idea that, I mean, when you think about what this becomes, it's like, this is not a mild choice. I mean, Judas alone would be such a complicated choice. And we don't know when Jesus learned the things about Judas, you know, that he does. But it is that dynamic that it's just important. This is a really important decision, because these guys will be carrying on in his work there, his plan A of how to carry out this message once he leaves. And to some degree, he knew that. You know, I think there is this learning process that Jesus himself is going through. Like at this point, like in the text, it said Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. That doesn't mean he knows that he's going to be a traitor. It's simply because this is written afterwards, of course. You know, Luke writes these things on after Jesus has died and resurrected and these kind of things. And so anyway, so we don't know. But anyway, the point there is Jesus knows it's a complicated decision. Now, here's the rub for me, and we alluded to this. I think you even said this in the introduction. Why choose? Why choose? You know, and this is where the perplexing stuff always gets me, is what do I do with it? Like, okay, so I'm a minister. I get paid. That's my full-time job, to be a minister. Am I discipling people? Because if Jesus only chose 12 as his inner circle, now he had more disciples than this, maybe 500, but what does that mean? Do I need to have a group inside the congregation I'm working with? Did he only choose 12? Just simply like he could have chosen another number from the Bible. 40 is a good number from the Bible. If 12 is good, 40 is better, you know. 70 is a number that shows up. You know, why not 70, you know? And so he chooses 12, and I agree. It goes back to the 12 tribes. But again, we only see that as, oh, yeah, it needed to be 12 because it was 12. If he had chosen 79, we're like, okay, eventually he sends out 72 disciples. Is that the magic? Do you see what I'm saying? It's like what? Why 12? Why the difference between disciple, learner, and apostle is one who is sent. It's like, why do this at all? And what do we learn from that? Do I need to have a sense of, I have a group that I have an impact on, and so let's say I'm not a professional minister. I have 6 people that I see have an impact on, my spouse and my kids and my whatever, you know, my friends. So do I need to choose one of them to be the inner apostle? You see what I'm saying? Like, what's the implication here of this choosing? Because it's important to remember, and I mean, it seems like a kickball dynamic. He's like, guys, I'm going to be doing some choosing. See, I would love that narrative to know, how did he do it? He's like, everybody up against the wall and face me. Don't put your hands on the wall. Like, I'm not arresting you, but it's that idea of, it's like saying, I choose, let's go with Peter and with John and with Thaddeus. We know at least 2 guys are there named Matthias and Barsabbas. We don't learn that until Acts chapter 1, because they choose one of them to replace Judas, which that's another thing. Why not just do both? You know, eventually they had Paul, so now you have 13 apostles. It's already a baker's dozen. Like, you're off already. So it's just this weird, to me, it's kind of arbitrary. And I'm not a numerologist, so I do get that there's some significance, but I'm like, why is he feel the freedom to send out 72, why not just choose 72? And again, the reason things perplex me most of the time is because I don't know what to do with it. Because ministers are responsible for everybody that crosses their path. So if you got 300 or 400 people in your congregation, or 1,000, to some degree, you're part of the discipling process for all of them. So it is. I don't know what this teaches me.
Yeah, I echo a lot of what you have to say. I do think, I wonder. I don't think Jesus is doing just one thing. I don't think he's just like, I don't think he's praying to God and being like, we got to get 12 because, I really only have a good, strong 10. So let's stretch it out. And God, Judas, yeah, I mean, we could fudge the number. We'll get to that. We'll fill out our team with some scrubs at the end of the bench. I don't get the sense that that's what's happening. Although maybe, I don't know. What I wonder, if one of the small aspects of what Jesus is doing is he chooses 12 because he knows that it will mean something to them, to think about where they are at, what they're going through, what their emotions are. Again, they're people who are steeped in Jewish religion, in tradition and history. And to have this rabbi who's outside of the traditional rabbinical system come by, choose you, pick you. And you're also, but don't have esteem, but you're picking up a lot of followers and doing crazy things. And you're caught in this whirlwind. And then all of a sudden, and then as soon you're going to have a lot of Pharisees coming against you, and Jesus to be like, no. You view Jacob and you view his children and the tribes and how big of an impact and how important that is in every person that you talk to. I'm giving the significance of what we're doing here is even more so. And giving is there a piece of confidence that he's giving them? Is there a piece of responsibility? I can't say that that's the case at all, but I do wonder if one of the reasons he's doing it is for them.
Yeah, I do. I that resonates with me. And I think too, we know there's going to be a lot of self-questioning. There's going to be a lot of questioning about their role and are they valid? And so any encouragement he gives them.
Sure. Well, and thinking about your example of what do I do with this? I think about when somebody's a pastor. I've had this when I was a pastor and had the situation where I'd meet with somebody. There are some people who come in with the armor on of well, this is just what you do. You meet with people, you get coffee, and I'm just another number to you. I'm just another, you're getting paid to be here, so you have to be here. And there's a sense in which that's something to deal with. But what I do wonder is I think when we view what our biggest impact can be, if we are trying to be there's a sense, I think, if we have 6 or 7 or 8 or 12 people in our life that we have deep impact on, that we have an incredibly close relationship. If we are trying, I do think if we tend to be the kind of people that want to try and fill that with 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 200 people, there's a sense in which as we attempt to go wide, our depth, maybe I don't know. I'm just talking out loud. I don't know if this is even true or not. I do wonder if there's this small message for us can be the truth is the human bandwidth only has so much room to go so deep with so many people.
I think that's reasonable. I have sat in rooms with ministers who felt safe. So maybe there's 30, 40 ministers in the space, and they're, most of them are full time. If they feel any space to be honest, they're it's overwhelming carrying all these burdens. It's overwhelming just hearing the stories and then being carrying the expectation that I'll remember the stories, and they may not talk to me for 6 months, but when they do, they assume I remember all these details, And so it would be so relieving if Jesus came along and said, look, preach your sermons or do your ministry, whatever, but choose. Jesus had 12. We're going to go ahead and say you qualify for 2, and so it's like, pick 2, pick 1, pick one person that you're going to invest in. I think ministers, number one, I think that last a lot longer because they're just worn out, most of them. And honestly, that's probably the least of their concerns. The complete disrespect, the combative nature oftentimes of other leaders in the church, the territorialism, blah, blah, blah. List goes on and on. But I do think that would offer such relief. And if I do feel overwhelmed, to step back and say, okay, who has God given me right now that I have influence over and they have influence over me, and we're discipling together? That's actually clarifying. So that does represent a peace-bringing discipline for me.
So this kind of transitions to a what perplexes me, and it doesn't perplex me because it perplexes me because it goes against so often what we end up taking away from Scripture. When I get caught up a lot with Judas and get caught up a lot with how much Jesus knew, how much the other disciples knew what was going on, and when they knew it, and all of that's at play there. But when you think about like the preachers that if you said, hey, you've got 12 core guys that are just like, they're your guys who will go to bat for you, and you're like 11 of them, like one's going to stab you in the back, but 11 of them are going to be like, they might fail you every now and then, but they're going to be there for you in the end. You'd be like, I don't know a single person that wouldn't take that and wouldn't, take it running, screaming away, thinking they got the best deal ever. Because that feel, that betray. And again, like we know Peter does have some betrayal or whatever, but again, ultimately stands firm in the faith and is there for Jesus. I think what is perplexing to me is this is outrageously successful. It's like, just like, even again, we don't measure these things this way because Jesus doesn't seem to be, but just numerically, for him to pick 11 out of 12 random blue collar, white collar, where like just a random survey of Jewish guys like 2,000 years ago who had no special really religious training to be, and for him to be like, yeah, to get it right, you're like, oh, that can only be because he spent the night with God in prayer. That can only be because of the power of God at work. And so, yeah, I'm perplexed because there is a certain part where we read Scripture where I would think, like, if I was reading up to this, I'd be like, oh yeah, this is the part where we find out that we call them knuckleheads all the time, but actually Jesus only bats 50% here, but hey, 50% is a lot better than I've ever batted. So you know what? Good job, Jesus. But it's like, yeah, this is a miracle how well it works out.
I think so. I did the math, meaning I asked Google. 91, his success rate is 91.666667%. And so that's great. A 92% success rate. That's a solid A. And I mean, that's good. You're right. I don't know that I'd thought about it. There is another thing I'd throw in here is why tell us you chose them and only give us character development for 5 of them. It's interesting. We know more about Judas than we do Bartholomew, and it's because he acted out. It's like a parent has 12 children. Okay. Poor them. God bless them. That's what I meant to say.
Treasure and blessings.
But they have 12 children, and the one that acts out, because I've had this, the people that have had trouble in my life, I typically know them better than the people that it always goes smoothly because I'm invited into their life more in my role. But it is interesting. It's like, why name them if only 5 of them we hardly know anything about, And that's just another part of it that's perplexing. I think it'd be beneficial from a personality perspective to find the apostle you're most like. I think it would have been a good assignment. Matter of fact, I think this is how you disciple a person. Like, I don't know, we've done discipling together. We still do, but you never stop and say, hey, Jason, present a paper. But it would be reasonable to say, hey, what has your experience been in this? And I'm like, it'd be fantastic to have 12 books, that are here's the gospel according to, and we've got Mark, who wasn't an apostle, and Luke, who wasn't an apostle. So you got 2 apostles and 2 non-apostles writing it. And it's like, why not have 12? That'd be fascinating, And so I do think it's it's all interesting to me. And I don't think any of this blows the faith. This would just be things that would add color, as it were, add nuance to this, to be like, man, the way Simon the Lesser, which that's awful, but Simon the Lesser thinks about his relationship with Jesus, that relates to me. I think we have the similar personality. So it is interesting how you name the 12, but only really explore a few of them.
Yeah, no,
that's my double dipping on the perplexion. So there's that.
Yeah, no, that is incredibly fascinating to think about. The King of the universe coming down, going up to a mountain to pray to his Father, coming back with a list of names, and then just no further explanation. Like the writing there, it's almost, it's funny to me because I think it's one of those small things where like it helps me trust maybe the Bible even more, because you would think like, oh, a good writer here is like where you break down into like, and there's church history for pretty much every one of the disciples, some like, church history that you can lean on, and some you can more historical proof than others. You can do with that whatever you will. But yeah, there has to be a reason that's not the case, and I have some ideas, but I also can't know for sure, and that dims the brakes.
Yeah, I see that, and I think in the grand scheme, I think we have what we need for sure. I just think it's a very interesting. It's funny because you're like, well, of course Jesus chose 12, apostles. Not of course, first of all. And second of all, okay, if you're going to choose them, this is kind of like Peter going, well, if you're going to wash my feet, wash my whole body. That's functionally what I'm asking for. Well, if you're going to give me a little, give me a lot, tell me more, and you are right. In traditions, they have it. So I'm speaking specifically of the canonical, gospels, obviously the Gospel of Thomas, and there are other gospels out there. And I think, weigh those however you will, listener. But just that general dynamic of, if I'm going to name people, like the only reason we know that Bartholomew was an apostle and important to the mission is because of this passage.
Well, and what's funny as we finish up here, thinking throughout church history, and there's other things beyond like apocryphal gospel collections, just general church history and things that like the church fathers will pass down and say Bartholomew went to do this or whatever. The only through line through all their lives is that they all die a pretty brutal death, and so
that's why they're named here. These are all the guys that died, except the guy, except John in his exile.
Yeah, and so I think there's something we can take away from that, and but also just I love wanting to come back and center myself and recognizing this wasn't of course, and it's easy to assume when we look at other people's lives and the way that God moves, oh, of course it happened, or like, of course God has to work in my life in this way, and there is no of course, and that is scary for us because that means God won't fit in our box, but it also means that God doesn't fit in our box, and that's good news because our box isn't that good.
And I like that reflection because it's like, even in the choosing of 12, which we might think of as relatively straightforward, it's not. And so that reminds me, today is a day that's not, and of course, and that's what it's like living with a living God.